Hello and welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring today's most pressing global issues into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. Former U.S. President Donald Trump has become America's 47th president, defeating Vice President Kamala Harris. Once Trump re-enters the White House in January next year, he's expected to strongly push forward his America First policies that were left unfinished during his first term. One of Trump's key economic policies is protectionism, particularly through the imposition of tariffs. The second Trump administration plans to impose additional universal tariffs of up to 20% on all imported goods and steep 60% tariffs on goods from China. Concerns mount as the outlook for economic growth in export-dependent South Korea after Trump's re-election is likely to be more cautious. To break into the details and seek possible solutions to the upcoming changes, we invite Yang Jun-seok, professor of the Department of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Happy to be here.
And we're also joined by Hwa-kyun Kim, professor of banking and finance at Texas A&M University's Mays Business School. Great to have you, Professor.
Pleasure to be here.
So let's begin our discussion with Professor Yang. So now that we are expecting a second Trump term, how much of an impact do you think his re-election would have on South Korea's economy?
Okay, well, it'll first have an effect on trade because, as you emphasized, President Trump will likely to install higher tariffs and various protectionist measures. Now, the state-affiliated research institution just calculated that perhaps the Trump policies will cost Korea about 60 trillion won, or about $45 billion in terms of lost exports. That is about the effect of Korea-U.S. FTA, and it could have been worse. But the reason that it is not worse is that he's putting tariffs on everybody, not just Korea. So everybody's tariffs will go up. So Korea will perhaps lose some customers because of higher prices due to tariffs. But we will probably not lose it to any other markets other than perhaps American domestic production. But a lot of what Korea makes, there is no production base in the U.S. So while it will have a large impact, perhaps it will not be as worse as we fear. But another aspect is that Trump's policies, not only protectionism, but tax cuts, may result in higher inflation. Now, for the first year, because of the deficit spending, the U.S. growth may perk up. But then maybe from the end of the second year of his term or the third year, we may see higher inflation, and that means the interest rate may rise again, and that might actually be a bigger problem than trade tariffs.
Right, so there's a lot to touch upon. Now, Professor, the American economy, the third quarter growth rate of U.S. economy came in at 2.8%, which was below expectations, but still signs of growth. Do you think such momentum would continue following the election results?
Okay, well, U.S. second quarter growth was 3.0% annualized, and for third quarter, it was 2.8% annualized. So if we look at it the Korean way, which is quarter to quarter, that was going from 0.75% in second quarter to 0.7% in the third quarter. So U.S. economy may be slowing down, but it looks like it's more of a soft landing than any hard landing recession. So that trend will probably continue. Inflation is on a downward trend, though perhaps slower than a lot of people would like. But again, that trend is likely to continue. Whenever you have a new president, it takes about a year to get his policies into law and then for those laws to have effect. So the first year of any new president's policy is usually thought to be the aftermath of the previous president. So for this year and next year, we'll probably see this trend continue very slowly, slowing growth. So we could count on it as soft landing and continual reduction of inflation. But once Trump policies hit during probably the second year of his term, then we may see higher inflation. We may see some problems down the line because of protectionism. But for at least the next roughly a year or so, we will probably see this current trend continue of heading toward a soft landing.
Right, so it's still early to see the changes right away, the impact. Now, let's bring in Professor Kim into the conversation. Ever since Trump has been stressing his America First approach, could you explain his potential strategies towards China, particularly in terms of trade and economic policies?
I believe it's worthwhile to go over some previous experience because this is the second time. So, as you also mentioned, he's going to basically impose high tariffs, especially to China. And this America First means actually the China never, becoming first potentially, right? So it's going to have like a very massive protection mechanisms into play, and so that they can, the U.S. can pressure China into renegotiating trade terms. In the first term, there was like this agreement called Phase One. And there were a lot of things, but the main thing was to make China agree to increase the purchase of the U.S. goods and services. It was signed in January 2020 or something, and the result was not very successful. So only about half or even less than half of this promise was kept. So using this tariff threat or the bluffing strategy or actual strategy, I think Trump is going to increase this, the size of this, the purchase from China to the U.S. and clearly intellectual property and technology type of the deal will be even stronger now, so that they'll try to use Trump is going to just use this as leverage to basically make this American, the domestic manufacturing kind of revived or recovered. And investment restrictions, which is actually already played from the Biden's administration as well, is going to also probably strengthen. So these kind of things combined until the China is going to give up, I think. But China can also just impose tariffs and things like that. So it's going to have some trade war again, I think.
Right. So it seems likely that the U.S. will continue its policy of countering China. Now, this situation could create downward risks in the side of South Korea's economy. What kind of steps should South Korea take to mitigate these risks, Professor Yang?
Well, we can't really do anything about what the United States is going to do. We may try to negotiate some reduction in trade barriers that he'll try to convince Trump to impose less trade barriers than on other countries, but I really have doubts on whether that will be successful. So I think we should expect trade barriers to rise. Trump has mentioned that it will be 10% to 20% overall. He did also mention that on imported automobiles, he was mentioning Mexican cars, but if he imposes tariffs on Mexican cars, he'll probably impose them on Korean cars as well, and the rates he's talking about there is 100 to 200%. So we probably won't be able to avoid a lot of that. So perhaps a better strategy for Korea is try to seek third markets, but again, the third markets may be limited. Korea's two largest partners are U.S. and China. They will both be affected by the Korea-China trade war. So probably the most practical move that we can make is perhaps, at least until the Trump's term is over, do not count on exports to be the engine of growth for the Korean economy. We should take more emphasis on trying to stimulate domestic economy rather than trying to improve growth through exports.
Right, so reducing dependency on exports could be a possible answer to that. Now, meanwhile, Korean companies are closely also watching the uncertainty surrounding the Inflation Reduction Act. As far as we know, Trump advocates for its repeal. How would this impact Korea's electric vehicle and battery industries, Professor?
Okay, well, Trump has mentioned that he does not like electric vehicles. He does not like electric batteries. He would prefer to not have any subsidies in those categories. This will apply to not only Korean firms, but American firms most likely as well. So there is a good chance, especially if the House of Representatives and the Senate, the control goes to Republicans, which it right now seems very likely. The Senate is already going to be under the control of Republicans. They're still counting some of the votes for the House of Representatives. But if both of those houses are under the control of Republicans, they may try to repeal the IRA. Now, for state subsidies, they will probably remain because, well, state governors would like to have those factories inside the United States. But for federal subsidies or federal tax cuts, we may not see them realized if the IRA laws are repealed.
Right. Then given this situation, Professor Kim, what kind of strategies could South Korea's electric vehicle industry consider to tackle that?
Well, compared to other electric car companies, Korean car companies still have very good, gasoline-based car technologies. So I think having more diversified strategy, I think, is going to be very important. And the market share, I think, of the Korean cars in the U.S. actually has been increasing, and I can kind of see more and more Hyundai and Kia cars on the road, actually, and very popular. So at the end of the day, it is U.S. consumers who purchase cars, not Trump administration. So it's a cliche, but at the same time, it's the most important thing. So if cars are good, there's no way that it cannot be sold. So I think, innovations and consumer engagement, brand loyalty type of things should keep getting emphasized. And I think the Korean auto manufacturing companies came a long way to arrive here. So I think if they continue to do that, of course, they still stay on alert in terms of like the regulatory changes and things like that. If they just keep doing this well with the nice design and reliability cars, actually, that's probably the best strategy.
Right. So stick to the basics and keep the quality. Meanwhile, South Korea's semiconductor industry is also on edge, especially with Trump advocating for the repeal of the CHIPS Act, which offers subsidies to companies building semiconductor plants in the U.S. Professor Yang, what would be the impact on the local semiconductor sector?
Okay, well, I think we're going to be luckier in semiconductors, and that's because the United States doesn't really have a lot of production capacity. One of the reasons why the United States was giving so much subsidies to Korean and Taiwanese firms is that they wanted to build up production capacity because, well, for the semiconductor firms in the United States, they see foundries, production capacity as something that takes a lot of capital, but it's very low margin. So for them, they prefer to put their investment in designing and research into new chips. So if President Trump has mentioned during the campaign that he would take away the subsidies and replace them with tariffs, put tariffs so high that Korean and Taiwanese firms will have no choice but to build facilities in the United States. But the current U.S. Secretary of Commerce has mentioned that the chips produced in the United States are likely to be somewhere between 20 to 40% more expensive than global prices for semiconductors. So that means President Trump, if he really wanted to use the tariffs to increase production facility in the United States, he'll probably have to raise the tariffs for semiconductors above 20%. That means the prices for U.S. consumers as well as companies which use semiconductors will go up considerably. TSMC has already said that if President Trump installs higher tariffs, they will raise their prices for semiconductors going to the United States and presumably made and sold in the United States as well. So in this case, if President Trump does go through with the threat, because the United States currently does not have enough production facilities for semiconductors in the United States, he may be shooting himself in the foot.
Right. Professor Young, let's circle back to trade now. Trump is also known as tariff man. He proposed a blanket tariff of up to 20% on all imports, 60% on Chinese goods. Given Korea's heavy reliance on exports, how significant could the impact be if these kinds of tariffs were imposed?
Okay, well, as I mentioned, one research institution in Korea mentioned that exports to United States may fall by up to $45 billion. And this comes not only through reduction in direct exports to the United States, but through exports to China or South Asian countries, because these countries often import intermediate parts from Korea and then use those intermediate parts to produce their own goods for exports, which goes to the United States. So it will not just be the Korea-U.S. trade, but also Korea global trade, which will be affected overall. So there is significant concern, but again, President Trump will raise tariffs, at least currently. If his statements are to be believed, he will raise tariffs on everybody. So we will have higher trade barriers, but we will probably not lose markets to other countries. If the U.S. has domestic production capacity, like in the automobiles, those sectors may take significant hits. But for something like semiconductors or other manufacturing where the United States doesn't really have that much production capacity anymore, then at least until the U.S. Builds more production facilities, which may take 4 or 5 years or maybe even decades, Korea's impact on Korea should not be as much as some of us are fearing right now.
Right, so the impact would differ from sector to sector. But on the flip side, what kind of industries could benefit from Trump's victory, Professor Kim?
Well, after this election results, when we look at the stock market, some of the industries have huge rallies in the U.S. So, for instance, like a banking sector, and also small firms in general, and those type of and then the manufacturing actually some of them have rallies, but as long as they have this fragmentations or of the supply chains, or they have like outsourced stuff like from all over the countries, they actually have huge downfall. So probably a good thing for South Korea would be those that have this, the huge, the downside of like the movement of the stocks in the U.S. in some sense, because probably we have more the edges or the advantages. So for instance, like, still the manufacturing is going to be important, semiconductor is going to be important, and, these kind of things, despite that we will have tariffs and the big, the stumbling blocks in terms of this trade policy, but still, I think these seem to be still the most lucrative stuff for Korea in some sense. And also, I think, the more cultural products and then K-beauty type of things would be useful. And it's not as big, but I think, relatively better ticket items, I think.
Right. And Professor, looking just a little ahead, the U.S. FOMC is meeting on November 7th, and there's speculation that the Fed may cut interest rates by 0.25%. But with Trump's victory, many say this could bring some changes. What's your forecast?
So if we look at the Fed Watch, which is based on the Fed futures, the likelihood of 25 basis point cut is about 99%. So if we don't see the cut, that's actually more surprising. So according to what market participants expect. Having said that, I think the Professor Young mentioned it earlier. The questions, the U.S. economy was showing some good, strong, the employment or the GDP statistics in September, but kind of softened in October. So I think it is going downhill a little bit, not too bad. So I think, this kind of thing is more like a basis for another 25 basis point cut. What's more kind of talked about now, I think, in Wall Street is the December cut, whether that will be the case or not. And then there are a lot of debates. And the Trump election is possibly affecting a bit. I mean, supposedly, the independent, but still. So to make a long story short, I think the next one, I think November cut seems to be more like very expected, 25 basis point, but the December cut is still uncertain, and maybe this Trump's, the election results may affect the December cut as well. But at this stage, it's somewhat all over the place.
Right, it's kind of still early to predict. Now, with the U.S. election finally over and we're expecting massive changes, let's hope the government, private sector, and the public could work together and prepare some suitable measures to make the most of the upcoming changes. Professor Yang and Professor Kim, thank you so much for your insights tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, we will have to end it just right here. Thank you for watching Within the Frame. We will return again tomorrow at the same time. Be sure to tune in. Thank you for watching.